So I'm supposed to give a demo of React, and I will definitely show a demo. I mean, Qwik React, not React. I want to show you something else first, okay? Because I think it's cool. So let's do a different kind of demo for a second, and then I will definitely show you React. Let's see. Let's make a new route, new file, and demo/index.tsx. Component. It has to be a default export. So, this is basically how you create a route. And so it's demo. And so, here is the text, you change it, etc. Everything updates. I'm not going to show you how there's no JavaScript, etc. But I do want to show you an example. I know you've seen the counter millions. This text or the other side? This? No, it's good. I appreciate being helpful. Like, that's great. Okay, so here's a button, +1, unclick. Okay, now imagine for a second. Account value. Console.log. Okay, imagine we have a click here, and why is this not complaining? Missing curlies, thank you. I know how to write JavaScript, really. So imagine that there is something that's expensive. Console.log, expensive. Okay, now, yeah, we already showed you, you click on it, the expensive stuff really only shows up when you click on it, otherwise it's not there. That's not that interesting, but what if the expensive stuff only has to run if the count value is even? 2 = 0, right? Okay, so now it only shows up when it's so if I hit 1, it doesn't show up. But if you click on it, you see that it actually showed up. What if I wanted to lazy load this piece of code? How could I do that? Yeah, I mean, well, but not what I mean is, like, imagine that the expensive part is like very, very big and I don't want to execute it immediately. So what we could do is we can turn it into a function, right? You can say function equals, no, come on. Copilot is, no pilot, yeah. Okay, so far I haven't really done anything, right? I turned it into a function that I call later. And so you can still see it works, but it only prints every other time, but it still eagerly downloads the code, right? What if all I had to do was to wrap it in $? Let's import it. All I had to do was wrap it in $, and all of a sudden, check this out. The code doesn't download, and then when it's even, only then does it download later. So the lazy loading, or rather delayed referral, is as simple as wrapping something in $. It's not how it works in other frameworks. Now, what if, the thing was expensive in terms of computation? What if I wanted to run it on a server? So right now, it was running on the client, but now when I click, notice it disappeared, but now it's on a server. And all it took was just marking that this function should be pinned to the server, and all of a sudden you get that. I think that's pretty cool. No? Now, my other favorite demo is, let's say I have a clock over here, and it's probably going to import the wrong clock. So let me just try this. Let's see. This one? Yes, did I get the right clock? No, of course not. Oh, no, actually, it is the right clock, I think. All right, so we have a clock over here. Oh, no, that's not the right clock. Where is the right clock? Oh, yeah, it's this one. Let's try this again. Okay, so now we have a clock, and a clock runs. And of course, the code has to, obviously, the code for the clock update has to be eagerly downloaded. But here's something interesting. What if the clock is below the fold? What if I have a style that's height, which is 100 VH. All of a sudden, clock is below the fold, no JavaScript, scroll the clock into the view, JavaScript shows up. Can you do that in your framework? All right, let's talk about React. So let's say I wanted to get a React component in here. So let's make a new file next to me called slider. What? Yeah. Okay, so let's make a slider.react, and let's say I want to create a React. What am I calling itself? It doesn't matter. Okay, let's say I want to create a component in here in React. So the way you create a component in React, really I can type, is you say const hello equals you're so funny, dude. Okay, so here is a component that I have created in React, but it requires a little bit of thing. Okay, here, sorry. It requires a pragma to tell optimizer that this is React code, not Qwik code. So make sure you compile it the React way, not Qwik way. Okay, so now what if I could say export, hello, what am I going to call it? Export const hello React equals Qwikify. No, Qwikify hello. Here we go. All right. So, oh yeah, I have to use the component. Sorry about that. Hold on a second. There's a button. What did I call it? Hello. This one, right? So now if I import it, voila, it is code here from React. Now, just to prove to you that this is React, let's make a counter in React. Const, what is it? Count, count, comma, set count equals use state. 1, 2, 3. Count is count button +1 on click, set count +1. All right. So notice it's, this is actually React code, right? Nobody would confuse this for anything else. Okay, but let's click on it. It doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work, well, there's no JavaScript, right? The React requires hydration. So we now have to decide at which point do we hydrate this particular thing. So when we did a Qwikify, we need to choose hydration strategy, and it's eagerness, is it? Here we go. Eagerness is hover. So let's say we do a hover strategy. Usually we probably do visible, but like for the purposes of the demo, let's do hover. And so now we have a component, and as I move my mouse over it, the moment I move it out, it lazy hydrates, and you can see that React is in there. Thank you, Dan. You can see the React is in here because you get the DevTools, and look at that, it works. So let's do something more complicated. How about we take a material UI button, import button from material UI. Is it like this? I don't remember. Is that the right one? Okay. Export const button React equals Qwikify button, and voila. Okay. So, oh yeah, we got to use the button. So maybe instead of our normal button here, we change it to React button. Okay, well, we'll get to it. I know what I'm doing. Okay, so now we have a button, the material button over here, but of course it doesn't work. Well, I'll show you. If I don't hover over it, right? Even if I hover over it, it doesn't work because I didn't tell it how to hydrate it, right? But notice that the server side did the hydration. So of course, I can certainly do a strategy in here, say eagerness hover. And now I will have a material button that works over there. I'm not sure why that like temporarily does that. I need to look into it. But now, we have a button. So this button is a React button, and this counter is a Qwik counter. And notice that we are correctly passing the click listener to React. And so we're handling that particular part. So that's cool, but we can actually do something else. You know, like a button is such a simple thing. How about we don't even hydrate the button? So let's just get rid of this. And then instead of putting an on click on, giving it to React, we can just tell Qwik to set up a click listener independently of the underlying technology, right? And so now the Qwik is doing the listening for the button, and React never downloads. Let me refresh this. See, the Qwik code runs, but there's nothing in the console that the React is happening. And so it's only when I hover over this that you see the React comes in. So we can do these kinds of things. But let's do something more complicated. So what if we had a display that displays the current count? So let's go here. And so let's just make it simple. Const display equals Qwikify. And return div count is count. So now we need to get count, and we need to tell React that it is count is not a number. Okay, so now let's use this display for rendering the components. So instead of doing the button here, we can do display. We can do count. What is this Copilot? That is not how we write code. Okay. Copilot. What did I say? Copilot. All right. So here's a display component, and this button won't hydrate, right? So now if I hover over the bottom, it hydrates. So let me not do that. But if I don't hover over the bottom, this button here is a React button. Qwik wakes up, but notice what happens. In order to re-render the child, Qwik is like, oh yeah, I have to wake up the component over here. And so what's happening here is that the change of the count signal alone is sufficient to cause hydration of the component, because, well, how else are you going to tell React to hydrate, right? So you have React, and you can have lazy components, and it kind of comes online when you interact with it. Yes.
We're imagining that you can put like units as a record.
Yeah, so you can also, what he's saying is that you can do, so let's go back to the regular button. And so it's, what is it? No, it's not that. It's client. There we go. Client hover. Okay, so by adding client hover, now we're going to hydrate just by hovering. So we can override what's happening by the default, right? And so you can use React Material UI or any other React library. So for example, I was playing with Supabase the other day, and Supabase has a login page. And the login page is, of course, written in the React component. And I was like, do I rewrite it or not? How about I just wrap the React login page using Qwikify, and then use that, and then let the rest of the system kind of take care of itself. So you can do that. I think there is a, let's see, clock static. Okay, let me show you another interesting demo that I think it's worth pointing out. How much time do I have? Well, I don't want to put people to sleep. Okay, so this is the architecture demo where I talk about like how different frameworks hydrate. So this is basically how React works, right? Or Angular, Vue, Solid, all the main ones. And so you SSR the content, then you ask to download the JavaScript, and as the JavaScript's executing, right, you're hydrating the pages, you're attaching the listeners. So you saw how it slowly came into be. And when you have too much JavaScript, the experts will tell you, but just download the stuff that you don't need. And I'm going to show you how lazy loading is not as simple as you think. Because, sure, you download code, you hydrate the shell, and then you come across a lazy loaded boundary. Because the component you're lazy loading is visible, or rather it's in the render tree, you have no choice but to request it and download it. So lazy loading in all existing frameworks is only useful for components that are not in the render tree. And that's something that I think people don't realize, because they say oh, my app's too big. Just lazy load stuff. Yeah, but all the other stuff is on a separate route. It's already lazy loaded. And the stuff that I currently see on my current route, well, that can't really be lazy loaded because the component is probably visible. For the components that are not visible, maybe like a modal dialog box, etc., those you can certainly lazy load. But if it's in the render tree, then you can't do it. So then you have a lazy loading technology like Astro, and they basically say, hey, turn it into an island. So if you click on one thing, the island kind of wakes up and hydrates. And then you click on another thing and it hydrates. Now, the problem is, suppose this is a buy button. If I click this, what it's supposed to do is tell the shopping cart to render. It's supposed to wake up this component, right? So how is this button exactly supposed to talk to this guy? And people will say like, oh, no problem, just send a custom event. Well, first of all, yes, you can do that. But if in order for me to send a custom event, the other side already has to be hydrated and listening, right? So the only way I can talk to the shopping cart is if the shopping cart is already hydrated. Isn't that the point of islands, is like not to hydrate them and have them all done lazily, right? So the point is not that it's not possible to do in this technology. Certainly you can achieve that, but it's not just out of the box. It's not something that you just get. It is work that you have to put in. And as you're putting all this work in, you're making your applications more complicated, because you can't just have components that share a state, which is how you normally would solve this problem. You have to have other pieces of code, right? And so the thing to point out is that if you, for example, have this as a buy button, and if I click it, then it knows, because these two share state, to also wake up the shopping cart and re-render it. But there's nothing I had to do as a developer to get there. Like, it's just how the system works, right? So if I go and click here, it knows to wake up this component because maybe I want to see the image from the opposite side or something like that, right? And so the point to understand is that as I interact with different things, I start lazy executing the code associated with it. But notice, for example, here, I didn't force to also execute the children. Just because I executed a parent doesn't mean the child also has to execute, right? And so it's very surgical. But even this is not really a good picture, because this implies that the whole component is waking up. But that's not actually what's happening, because you are essentially not really even waking things up. You're just like executing different parts. And you might only execute, for example, the buy button of a particular component, and the other portions of the component will never execute. For example, the rendering might never download, or maybe the buy button also has like a sub menu that like shows, I don't know, like put it on hold or something like that, right? That code also won't download because you didn't interact with it. And so even this picture is not correct, because it implies that there's component level boundaries, which is not what's actually happening. What it is function level boundaries, right? Individual functions that are wrapped in $sign is kind of what make this stuff work. Okay, so we talked about like this idea of streaming, and this one. Okay, so Shai is big on streaming. So let's see what do we mean by that. Imagine you have a long page. As I'm scrolling, different components come into view. Look, the clock comes into view, the code downloads, right? I don't know, I just found this on the internet, something comes into view, that the parallax, right? This is what I mean. This is what we mean by streaming, is that the code shows up on as needed basis. But the more important thing is, as a developer, I didn't have to do anything. Like, it's just how the framework works. Just like I showed you, the clock, is eagerly downloads, but then if you put it below the fold, it no longer eagerly downloads, and so it's lazy. And so this is the thing that we're aiming for, is that as a developer, you shouldn't have to think about it. I mean, yes, you can make anything slow, as Dan points out. People are creative enough, they can figure it out. But the thing is that in normal systems, you will be slow because it grows, and now you're responsible somehow to making it more efficient. Whereas a lot of the basic things that are heavy lifting of breaking things up, not downloading things eagerly or anything of that, are just automatically taken for you in Qwik. Yes.
Is the clock eagerly download?
Okay, so this is a dev mode, and so in the dev mode, you are everything is lazy, and so it's lazy being downloaded. In production, things work differently. In production, there's a service worker, and the job of the service worker is to go ahead and start prefetching code that might be needed. So that when you are in production, the situation should be that any interaction that you do should always be a cache hit because the service worker's job is to make sure that the cache is populated with all the things that you can possibly interact with. And so the way this works is that, okay, let's actually talk about that for a second. So let's look at this example. So if you go into the element view, in the element view, we can run a query that basically says document.query selector all and say, hey, give me everything that is click. Okay. Wait, nothing click? That's not true. Oh, because it's an attribute. Duh. No? What? What am I missing here? Is it because everything's React and they have no more click listeners? Oh yeah, it's because everything's React. I have no more click listeners. Okay, let's go to a different one. Let's go to the good old counter. Okay, this one. Here we go. Okay, so because everything was React, there was no click listeners left. Because okay, you get it what I mean. So the service worker can basically run these queries and says like, hey, what are all the possible things you as a developer can interact with, right? If there is no click button on a page, then the user's clicking are meaningless. So in order for the user to interact with the page, there has to be a listener somewhere in a DOM. So if there is no listener in a DOM, there's nothing the user can do, right? And so the listeners are kind of the main points of the application. And because of that, the service worker can simply just look at the DOM and say, hey, what are all the possible ways that you can interact with this page? And from this, the server's worker, in this particular case, we got all these interactions, right? It can look at it and it can look at a link, basically. It can look at what the URL is, and that's how the service worker knows what to prefetch. And here's the interesting bit. Suppose you don't have anything here, like you have a button you click on, and a modal box comes up. And when the modal box comes up, there are new ways of interacting with the page. And so now the service worker gets notified. It's like, hey, new code got rendered. There's a whole new set of QRLs on a page. Make sure you have those too. And so as you are interacting with the page and more menus open up, more possible ways that you can interact with the page, the service worker is one step ahead of you and is prefetching all the stuff so that when you actually do click it, the code is always available for you, right? And so, yeah, that's the number one question is like, does it mean it's going to be slow every time I interact with it? And the answer is no. If things are working the ways they're supposed to be working, then a service worker is always prefetching the code. And so the service worker prefetches the code isn't the same thing as just downloading the whole application. Well, there's two things. First of all, service worker is not downloading everything, only the thing that you can interact at this point. And the second thing, I don't need hydration, man. You're funny. But you did derail me. What were we talking about?
Service worker sounds like downloading everything.
Right. Oh, right. So first of all, you don't have to download the whole thing, right? The second point to make is this: in Qwik realizes that many components are server-side only, right? They don't have any interaction, and therefore they cannot be interacted with. And the last bit is that in Qwik, yeah, sorry, I'm getting confused here. So many of the code. So the first thing is not everything is visible. The second thing is many components never ever download. And the last bit is even if they download, they're not executing, right? So you have all of these advantages. So the worst possible outcome for Qwik is that it has to download everything. That worst possible outcome is the normal outcome for your normal application, right? And even if it downloads everything, it probably won't execute anything because of reasonability unless you have something like a clock that needs to execute eagerly. And even then, it's a small portion of the page, right? Versus normal outcome for a normal framework is to do hydration, which requires complete execution of the component from top to bottom. Okay, let me show you. I think something interesting called what we call data shaking, or you know what a tree shaking is, right? So what if we can do the same exact thing for data? Actually, let's make a new file. Data index.tsx q.component. Okay, Okay, so let's render something here. Count const state const state equals use signal hello. Oh no, let's do world. Hello name.value. Okay, so here is our basic hello world, right? And let's go to data. Okay, so you would think that because there's a state in here that Qwik has to serialize it. So let's have a look. So Qwik serialization goes into Qwik.json, and as you can see, nothing got serialized. So that's fine. Let's make it interactive. So let's create a input type. Okay, so we're going to find that value. Okay, so now notice Qwik had to serialize a whole bunch of things because I could type here and I'm, I can, update the stuff. And because of that, the serialization has to happen here. So notice the interesting bit is that just by commenting the input, nothing gets serialized, and uncommenting, the stuff gets serialized. So we could, for example, fetch some data on a server, const use data route loader. And I'm just going to pretend that I'm talking to a database, right? By returning something like that. And I have to export this. And let's say const data equals use data. Okay, and then we are going to print this out. Data value.map. Now, interestingly, look, it knows that name is a string because everything kind of the type information flows correctly through the system. Let me just give it a key so it doesn't complain. Okay. So now the question becomes, does this data serialize? And if you go and look at the output, it does not serialize because, well, there's no way to change it. And so as a result, why would you have to serialize it? So there is kind of a tree shaking happening on a component, on a data level, not just on a code level, right? And the amount of code that shows up is relative to it. We can, for example, force the serialization by saying, hey, what if I have a filter input type? Yes, good job, Copilot. Okay, so what? Copirates, yeah. So still no serialization of the data because there's no way to re-render it. So, but let's now do filter. So now we have a name, and so now we're saying name dot includes. What does it includes? Oh, screw it, index off. Filter value not equal to -1, right? And so notice it's only at this point that we now have to serialize the data, right? Misko, Shai, and Yoav, because it's only at this point where you can actually start doing the search. So the data that's being sent, which is being serialized, is totally dependent on how you kind of use it. So if you fetch data on a server and then render some component, but the data is not editable, which is kind of the most of our applications, then that data never gets sent to the client. And the way this works is that you start with the listeners, right? The only way to interact with the page is the listeners. In other words, the on input here and input over here, right? Those are the only things that you can do as a user. And so what you do is you start serializing things, right? And so you say, okay, so this on input is closing over the name, so I need to serialize the name. And this name, is closing over because there was a read over here. This name has to close over the DOM location, right? So this has to serialize the reference to the DOM. But this filter is the same thing. You start here, and because there is a read in this location, we have now created a listener. And because we created a listener, this data is reachable from the code. And if I comment this out, I no longer do a read unfilter that value. Because there's no read, now the connection between the filter and the data has been broken. And by breaking this connection, we now know we don't need to serialize it. So the way this works is more like a garbage collection where you start with your listeners as the roots, and then whatever is reachable is the only thing that gets serialized. So if something isn't reachable, means it is impossible for the user to perform an operation that would require editing of the data, and therefore, why are you sending the data? And so you just don't send it. Okay. I think it's 9 o'clock, right? We should end it. Unless somebody wants a specific thing or a question, etc. Yeah, questions. I love questions. So ask away. How something works, why it is the way it is.
You mentioned earlier the service worker deciding which components we fetch. I did not understand this part of that.
No, it's a good question. Peeling the layer. The question was, how does the service worker know what to prefetch? Okay, so right now it uses guessing, and it sometimes guesses wrong. But we have already some customers in production, and they're complaining about this particular thing. So I'm working actually on real user metrics. What it is that as you're using the application, even in development mode, the system keeps track of what symbols ever made it to the client. And because we have this information, then the service worker knows exactly what to download, because the service worker essentially builds up a graph saying, like, if you need this symbol, then you're also going to need these symbols. And so it knows that, like, if you click over here, that, like, oh, historically I have seen this behavior, therefore let me just prefetch all this stuff. And because symbols are intentionally designed to have hashes that don't change as you use them, you can use the information from development mode to the next build, or you can let the application run for a while and then collect information, and then the next version of the application will have a better caching capabilities. So the system learns.
Until the guy from the QA starts running the app and doing everything worse.
It doesn't matter, because even if the person from the QA does everything possible, all that person is doing is just pushing all of the possible ways that you can interact. And that's very much the purpose of the service worker, is to make sure that all the possible interactions get fetched ahead of time, right? So you actually do want the person from the QA to do all of this stuff, right? Because the thing that you want to find out is which symbols never ever make it to the client, right? If a symbol has never ever made it to the client, then don't prefetch it, right? It's pointless, because in all of our history of watching, people interact with the application, nobody has ever caused that symbol to download, and therefore we probably don't need it as a server-only thing. But just to point out that if the service worker gets this wrong, the consequence isn't a broken application. It's just like you have to wait a little longer for this particular case, and now we record it in the database, and we know next time that, like, oh yeah, this thing has to be there.
Also about the service worker. Does the service worker take into account the quality of the network and whether or not it's in use or free?
As of right now, the service worker just simply has a list of things it's supposed to get. Actually, let's go to a real application. So the way the service worker knows this is because the server, when it was rendering, learned about all the possible interactions on this particular page. And it produces a file, which I believe is this one. Right, here we go. Which just dispatches an event called qprefetch. And this is how you're talking to the service worker. And then you tell it, these are the bundles that you want, right? And so as part of rendering, the SSR part, right, it figured out, like, these are definitely things you might need. You might need other things. We have to learn that from kind of people actually using, but you definitely need these. And so the service worker starts prefetching it. Now the service worker also has a graph saying, like, oh, this thing might import this other thing, right, which would cause waterfalls. And so the service worker understands this, and so it automatically, transitively records everything. And so it's basically the service worker's job is to say anything that's possibly reachable from this point, make sure you download ahead of time. We might have other ideas in terms of, like, making sure that you do it in the correct order, or some other things we could do in the future. But like the hard part is just having the capability to do this, right? The optimization is kind of easy or kind of relatively straightforward. The hard part with existing systems is that it's very difficult to break them up into pieces, right? That's the thing that Qwik solves out of the box. It just breaks everything to pieces. Deciding which set of pieces should go into which chunk and in which order, that's a relatively easy problem because putting chunks together is trivial. It's breaking things apart that's hard, right? And so we can, as we learn and as we get better with the framework and the system, it's going to be relatively easy to change these algorithms to decide like, oh no, actually you want to download this, or maybe the component is visible or something like that. Like they're all different optimizations that can be done.
But I meant something else. I meant, for example, let's say you're downloading a large hero image. You might want to go get out of the way while that's taking up.
I don't think service worker has access to the information. As of right now, the way this thing is set up is that the service worker, all the files, as you can see, they are Q-, and there is a location where they're loaded, /build. So as of right now, the service worker only touches the build folder and nothing else. It doesn't intercept anything else. And so as of right now, the service worker just doesn't have this information. In theory, you could do this. And, it's definitely a project worth exploring because Qwik gives you all the primitives so that you can do that, right? Like in existing systems, you don't even have the primitives to do this.
Leading question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is the next kind of developer experience enhancements that Qwik is planning?
So I'm working. What? What did Mono do?
The images.
That was just okay. So if you have an image, let me do this. If you have an image, source, and I'm going to just cheat here on something that doesn't exist. I don't know where the source is from. Okay. So if you have an image and you have a source, notice it complains immediately and says like, hey, you didn't provide width and height. This is not a good thing. This is going to end badly, right? And so right now it's only in here. But imagine that this image actually would show up. Would actually show up here. And what if you could hover over this image and it would be marked as like red, and then there would be a button that said like fix it, and then it takes the image size and then goes and updates the source code and basically puts width and height. So stuff like this is coming. Ooh, yeah. I think there was a question here somewhere. Are there any events that cause eager execution? Yes. If a clock is loaded, right? This is eager execution because you're saying that you want to do this. And the way this actually works, if you look into, remember how I said that everything at the end of the day, as far as we're concerned, is an event. No event means no code can possibly execute. So this thing is a special event called qVisible, right? And so if I go up here and I refresh this page and I go to qVisible and I change it to click, now when I put the clock into the view, it doesn't work. But if I click on it, it wakes up and starts working. So there's always an event. And so what we have done is we made a synthetic event qVisible, which you can place anywhere, and basically you get notified when the component becomes visible. Oh, how do you call prevent default? So first of all, you can declaratively prevent default. We do that a lot. So you can basically set markers saying prevent default. But there are rare cases where you need to decide programmatically whether or not to prevent default, right? So you cannot have it declarative. In a case like that, what we recommend is that you actually have to do like qVisible, wake up code, run JavaScript, and in that case, you have to manually do add event listener and pass in a synchronous closure for it. That's an extremely rare case, but it can happen. But that's the kind of the escape edge. Yes. The question was, can you customize the qVisible to like do it beforehand, etc. Not yet, but I don't think it would be that difficult to implement. So you just have to.
What if not scroll very fast?
I don't know. Usually it's there. Like, because the thing is that the prefetching will download your JavaScript, right? So even if you don't have this scrolled yet, the JavaScript's already waiting in the cache. And so when you scroll, all you have to do is make it, execute the piece of code. You don't have to run full hydration. So like you're executing very little amount of code. So in practice, I don't think this is really an issue. But yeah, I guess you could run into it, but we haven't yet. Or no more questions? Shai says I'm not allowed to talk anymore.
No, I don't care.